Hi, I'm Pastor Mike, and I started a channel with another pastor a few months ago talking about last generation theology. And after several episodes, I kind of decided I need to do a one episode dealing with the question of the delay. So, one of the things that last generation theology proponents are known for is the idea that they believe Christ's coming has been delayed because we haven't reach that stage where God is able to trust us with the close of probation. We haven't attained to character perfection and that type of stuff. But the idea of a delay in Christ's coming is independent of last generation theology. And I want to discuss the possibility of a delay. Apologies for the cheesy graphics, kind of a clickbait thing. Some people might be inclined to click on it just because of the way it's done. But anyway, um, so my position on this is that the idea that there could be a delay in Christ's coming is plausible. So, in other words, yes, it is possible that Christ's coming might be the kind of thing that can be delayed, and also it's plausible that that's in fact what happened. Now, I'm aware just from having endless conversations with other Adventist ministers, theologians, and so on that most people would disagree with me. So my colleagues in general either disagree or don't have anything to say, don't take a position on it, or are undecided. I don't know exactly, but I haven't. Um, I've seen a lot of people that just chose not to get involved in that whole question. Well, I personally think, even though it's not the kind of thing that we can prove, and I'll explain why in a second, I think it's a plausible scenario, and it's something that we need to really take seriously as a church. In other words, we might never be able to tell or to know if this thing is correct or not, this idea is correct or not, but we should probably act as if it is, given that if it is correct, we have more to lose by not taking it seriously than we have to lose if it's not correct and we do take it serious, kind of like the Pascal wager type of a scenario. Okay, so I've talked to quite a number of people about it, trying to figure out what it is that why people are against this idea, and I've come across quite a few people that um, seem pretty uh, adamant that there's something seriously wrong with the concept that Christ's coming can be delayed. But when I question them about it, I have not really received any good objections yet. So I'm putting this out there. If somebody does have good objections, then I'll be interested to hear what they are, because it's probably good that we address this issue one way or another anyway. All right. So why should this matter? I think there's some benefits to this theology of a delay. And there's personal benefits for it that I've at least experienced, and there's also corporate benefits. Now, from a personal standpoint, I grew up Adventist, and I was fairly well indoctrinated in Adventist theology from a very early age. I became a Christian first, like I made a personal decision to follow Christ somewhere around 1819. And then about the age of 21, I went to Andrews Seminary, and I was there for about a year and a half or so. And during this whole time, I had never heard or even considered the possibility of such a thing as Christ coming being delayed. So throughout this entire time, I grew up just thinking like, yeah, Jesus, our church has been around since the mid 1800s, expecting for Christ to come this whole time, but I really do believe he's coming in my lifetime. In fact, after my conversion experience, when I was again about 19 or so, I think that was right around the time that Mark Filney did that Net 95, or the first one of that sequence of satellite events. And I was just convinced at that time that, man, this is serious. We're right at the end. I don't think 5 years are going to pass before Jesus comes. And that was 25 years ago. And I went through that. I went to the seminary, and I came out of the seminary, and I still had never heard of the concept. Nobody mentioned to me, or somehow, if it had been said, it never registered with me that that's a possibility. That it is possible to somehow hasten or delay Christ's coming. And it wasn't until about a year or two later that somebody opened that up to my consciousness. And from that moment on, it actually changed my whole perspective on things and affected the trajectory of my life from that point on. And again, I'm fully aware that this idea could be wrong because it's not something that can really be proven. But I think the way it affected me was beneficial because it really motivated me to try to understand what is going on in the church, uh, what are all the issues that are taking place, what it is that we're doing, and how we're going about our work as a denomination, and all these different things. And I think I've thrown myself into that study or that research into this attempt to make sense of things, make sense of all of reality, make sense of other religions, atheism, everything. I've spent a lot of time studying all these things, trying to piece together how all this fits together, including our own denominational beliefs, because I was driven to figure out what's holding things up. So in that sense, I think it had a beneficial effect on my life, and I think it would be beneficial to others as well to consider this possibility and take it seriously, assuming there aren't serious problems with it, which I haven't found yet. Okay, so that's on a personal level. On a corporate level, I sometimes really wish as a church we would take a position on the delay because I think it would do away with all this nonsense that we keep having to face whenever there's some kind of crisis in the world. Everybody suddenly thinks, "Oh, this is it, the end." Everybody goes crazy and starts, talking about making predictions, and then we have all this conspiracists and all these people that bank on the superstition of the populace. uh, you know, I mean, you have people like Walter White that, the guy rakes in millions of dollars through his ministries. And then whenever the money starts slowing down, he comes up with some new prediction and gets everybody to send him money again. Predictions about, Jesus is going to come here or there, or this thing is going to happen or that thing is going to happen. Uh, David Gates goes around and signs contracts for millions of dollars with television stations, and then when he can't afford to pay it, he goes public with some prediction about the second coming and tells people to sell their houses and send him the money so he could pay off his debts. Stuff like that would never really happen if people had this concept of a delay to where they realized that the second coming wasn't impacted by stuff going on in the world around them, whether it's 9/11, whether it's the pandemic, whether there's a whole list of other stuff. And this stuff has been happening now for 150 years. So people take advantage of the less informed Adventist population by all these things happening around them in the world. And I don't think they would have the capacity to do this to them if people started thinking, no, the second coming revolves more around us and a work we have to do to finish and prepare for Christ's coming than around all the stuff happening around us, whether it's things that the Pope is doing or the UN or a whole slew of other stuff. Okay, so I think a lot of heresies, a lot of conspiracies would be dealt with if we educate our people with this concept of the delay. Um, and also I think it would give our church an incentive to try to fix its problems and to be more attentive to its past and what wherever it has made mistakes in the past, and to try to correct those errors, if he had this consciousness that we could be slowing down things by not being more dedicated to addressing our issues. So those I think are benefits at a corporate level of accepting our theology of a delay. Again, I understand the difficulty of this because then we would have, as a denomination, we would be forced to admit that we have faults, which is always hard. And a lot of people don't want to do this. They don't want to be put in a situation where they have to acknowledge that mistakes have been made and corrections need to be made and all that. So I understand why somebody would be hesitant to accept this idea as a denomination, but I think it would benefit us in the long run. Okay, so in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to deal with there's going to be 4 parts to the video. So first, I'm going to address some of the more common objections I've come across. Second, I'm going to explain why I think the idea is plausible. I'm going to take a little bit of time, since this has been a YouTube channel dealing with last generation theology, and explain why the last generation theology version of the delay doesn't work, and why there's another way to look at it that does make sense. And then I'm going to talk about what are some of the possible reasons for such a delay. Okay, so what are common objections? Now, a lot of times, even though, and of course, I could be, if we're talking to people that are not Adventists, obviously they're going to have a lot of objections to this idea. But even talking with Adventist theologians or pastors or whatever, a lot of times the objections they have are actually based on uh, ideas that they hold that are not themselves Adventist. So, for example, I've talked to Adventist ministers who approach the topic from a Calvinistic perspective, or a sovereignty of God motif, and they just can't imagine that God in His sovereignty would play games or be flexible with something as significant as the second coming. But again, the problem I think is with them, because they have this sort of theological baggage that they're reasoning through. It has nothing to do with the Adventist way of thinking. Calvinism is about as far from Adventism as probably any other concept out there. So I don't think we need to even engage with that idea, because it just has nothing to do with Adventism. Now, some people might not be that far off, and this is just one example of a foreign theology, but there's plenty of other external theological ideas that people bring to the table. And all I'm saying is, like, look, it's already expected that you're not going to agree with something like a delay if you disagree with Adventism on so many other levels. So let's just leave this aside and discuss those other issues first. But some people might agree with Adventism in general. They just have given up on the whole 1880, 1844, the whole sanctuary theology. And again, this whole thing doesn't work if people have done that. Now, I personally don't think people have good reason to give up on those theologies. I think a lot of the arguments that have been thrown out, like by Ford and a slew of other people since Ford's time, are bogus arguments that have been debunked to no end. That people just, they don't understand how the arguments work, so they don't understand why the arguments are so bad. And I've talked about this in other videos, and I might even do a video on this in the future, just dealing with Ford stuff and pretty much the whole uh, Fordian tradition that followed him, which is just a collection of ridiculous arguments that people can't seem to even recognize, because, anyway, for whatever reason. But that's not what this video is about. If somebody wants to even discuss some of these things, they need to take some time and understand the basics or the foundational elements of Adventist theology, so that we could then move over to this like higher level topics, like the sanctuary and all these things, and even have a conversation about that. Because essentially, people that disagree with things like the Adventist prophetic interpretation, the sanctuary, and topics like this, they disagree with Adventism at a more fundamental level, and we need to address those fundamental elements first. And if you need to do that, again, I'm not going to do it in this video because there's no time. But I have a YouTube channel and a podcast called Sola Scriptura Zoom Church, and a website. Just look those up. There's also a document that you could download and read. It's about 60 pages single space, so it's quite a bit of reading, but maybe not as big as other stuff. It's not a whole dissertation or anything. And over there, I try to lay this foundation, so that at least if we're going to have a conversation about some of the other topics, at least we're on the same page as to what Adventism is trying to accomplish. So we're not talking past each other. All right. So a lot of the people that disagree with the concept of the delay have much bigger disagreements with Adventist theology, which is fine, but there's no point in wasting time debating the delay with them, because it's a given that they're never going to accept it. There's disagreements at a much more fundamental level, and we need to leave that topic aside and focus on the other elements first. So my question for the people watching this video is, if you agree with all the other elements of Adventist theology, do you still have objections with the concept of a delay? After I give my presentation here and give my reasons for why I think this is a valid concept. All right, so, okay, besides this, sometimes people misunderstand the delay because they have a misunderstanding of the nature of divine foreknowledge. So, for example, they'll say things like, well, the Bible says no man knows the day or the hour except the Father in heaven. So if people can delay or hasten Christ's coming, that means they're going against something that God already knows to be at a certain date. But that's not how foreknowledge goes. God knows the future, even in those situations where we have a say in the matter. So, for example, God tells Hezekiah, "Hey, get your house in order because you're gonna die." And Hezekiah just prays and prays and cries out to God. And God says, "Okay, I heard your prayer. I'm gonna give you another so many years." So, did God know ahead of time that He was going to change what He had said to Hezekiah earlier? Of course He knew, because He has foreknowledge. He knows the future. He knows what's going to happen, even in those situations where people change something that He had originally set out. Okay, you could apply this to, the Israel entering the Promised Land. Well, they go back and spend 40 years in the wilderness. God knew that was going to happen, but He still went about things as if they were about to go in during the initial time. Did God know that Jonah was going to preach to the Ninevites, and the Ninevites were going to repent and get a pass, so to speak, on the destruction that had been promised? Of course He knew, because He had foreknowledge. The individual's choices don't affect God's foreknowledge of events. He already knows what choice they're going to choose in the end. So the whole idea of foreknowledge has nothing to do with God knowing the day or the hour of the second coming. Or this idea does not conflict with the possibility of a delay. That's a separate issue. Somebody coming from maybe like an open theist angle might have difficulties with that, because they might question the idea of foreknowledge. But that's a whole different thing. And again, people coming from that perspective are now really coming from an Adventist theological perspective. So they're essentially already having issues with the theology on a different level, and we need to discuss that as opposed to the question of the delay. All right, other other problems people have with this idea are that it's that they've only heard of it in the context of some heresy. So, for example, last generation theology, you have to reach perfection, and then you have to face Satan after the close of probation, and if you fall, like pretty much everything falls apart. The whole thing that I've discussed in previous videos, which is in fact a, a, a type of co-redemption, and it's heretical by its very nature. People have only heard the concept of the delay within this context, so of course they're going to reject it or dismiss it. Other people that have it are the 1888ers, the 1888 Message Study Committee, which in my opinion is also an Adventist heresy, even though I think it's a lesser heresy than the LGTers. But these guys have the whole thing about corporate repentance and all that nonsense. So, of course, somebody who's going to hear about a delay in the context of all this stuff, they're going to dismiss it because it just doesn't add up. I haven't done a lot of, I think it's a few years ago that I wrote some paper on 1888, but not much, because they're not as prevalent as they used to be. At least I haven't come across them as much, so I haven't had to deal with them too much. But their stuff is essentially people that don't understand theology. So they, and I'm not saying this in a negative sense. I'm just saying that when people discuss theology, they have certain vocabulary and they have certain terminology, and it works a certain way. And people that are not familiar with that end up um, misusing the labels. And then they think that they're coming up with a whole new theology, when in fact they're saying stuff that has already been said, but because they're using different words, they think it's something new. Anyway, that's a whole different thing that I don't want to get into now. But the 1888ers are another example of people that use the concept of the delay, but their solutions are so absurd that people just reject it. At least, educated, intelligent people. And then there's other possible heresies that kind of play around with that concept. Another thing I've come across is people telling me things like, "Hey, back in the day, I used to believe in this delay, and I just went out and tried to do ministry and work really hard, and I got burned out. And after some point, I realized, like, look, the second coming is not resting on my shoulders. I'm just gonna trust God to come when He's ready, and I kind of give up on the whole idea." And I understand why people will do that or think that way, but I don't think that's a valid reason for the delay. So again, people might dismiss the concept, but I don't think these are good reasons to dismiss it. Okay, another possible um, objection to the idea of delay is that it creates this sort of indefinite delay. Because if you say Jesus is coming has been delayed because he's waiting for the church to do something, or he's waiting for individuals to do something, well, if we don't do it, which is highly likely, because as a human race, we have thousands of years of history of not doing what God expects us to do. And if God is waiting for us to do something and we don't do it, then he might just end up delaying the second coming forever. And that's not possible. And of course, I think theologians like Last Generation Theology have that problem. They're kind of stuck in that situation. But because I don't think those theologies are valid, I don't think that's a necessary conclusion. In other words, we could say, look, there could be this sort of accordion situation where like Christ coming could be closer or further, but at some point he's going to come no matter what, and we don't need to be stuck in that kind of conclusion that ends up having other problems, because then people are going to say, oh, we're never going to be ready, Christ is going to keep delaying, he's coming forever, and people stop worrying about it and think they have decades and decades before Jesus comes, and essentially they fall into the other side of the problem. Now, another objection is this idea that, excuse me, this idea that SDAs are being way too arrogant to think that everything depends on them. Who do we think we are? Now, to me, I think that betrays a misunderstanding of the Adventist approach, but it also betrays a misunderstanding of Scripture, really, because if you look at the Bible, it's always been that way. I mean, God picks one family out of a whole world, like Abraham, right? And he calls them, and he works with Abraham and his family and his sons, and so on. And then he picks one small insignificant nation, and he works with them for like 1,000 years. And of course, somebody could say like, who do this Jewish people think they are? I mean, like, there's a whole world out there, millions and millions of people, and they're a handful of people, and they think they're the chosen ones. And then you have the apostles. You have a handful of apostles from the middle of nowhere going all over the world thinking that they're the only ones that have the truth, and they're the only ones that know who God is and what he's done and whatever. And that's just what it's always been. So I don't see how that is in any way in conflict with the rest of biblical history. Now, somebody might say, hey, maybe that worked in ancient times, but right now we're not the only Christians. There's tons of other Christians out there. But the reality is, if you look at all these other Christians, if you step back and examine the whole Christian landscape, you could pretty much put all these Christians into groups. They all follow some kind of tradition. There's a Catholic tradition, the Orthodox tradition, they're kind of similar. Then you have the conservative Protestant tradition, you have the liberal Protestant tradition, you have a few other groups, and so on. You could almost think of these as one religion. Like, Catholics are one religion, conservative Protestants, essentially conservative. And let me even split that up a little bit. You could take conservative Protestants into like traditional Protestants and fundamentalist Protestants, because there are some differences there. But you could put all this, thousands of denominations, you could put them into different groups, and they're essentially one religion that just hasn't figured out how to get along. I mean, that's all they are, because the foundational elements of their theology are pretty much the same. They all believe in sola scriptura, but they believe in the church fathers. So they try to find a way to build their theology based on the Bible and the church fathers. And because there's so much conflict in the church fathers, and because they don't have a way to make sense of Scripture otherwise, they end up splitting and splitting and splitting into all these little groups. But they're really one religion. And the fundamentalists, they're one religion, and so on. So in the end, either none of these groups are right, including us, or one of them is right. They can't all be right, because they're constantly in disagreement with each other. So, what difference does it make if we say things depend on us, and somebody else says no, they're the ones that are right, and everything revolves around them? I mean, it's somebody or nobody. I don't see the argument here. All right. So the next thing is, where is this idea in Scripture? Are you just getting it from Ellen White? And I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But I have a personal philosophy not to base any theology whatsoever on Ellen White. It's not because I don't believe she's a true prophet or because I think she's a lesser prophet, but because I think we as Adventists are the only people in the world that have the ability to build a purely sola scriptura theology. No one else has a working mechanism yet. And the majority of people have given up on the idea. And the only people that still claim to be doing a pure sola scriptura theology are the fundamentalists who nobody takes seriously. Essentially, they dismiss them as anti-intellectual or whatever. And and that's it. So most people have given up on the idea of a true sola scriptura theology because they don't think it's possible to do it. I think, and I think a lot of our people, a lot of our theologians have realized that we do have a mechanism for doing it. It's a valid mechanism, and that's what sets us apart. And because we're the only ones that can do sola scriptura theology, there's no reason to bring anything else into the on the table. Because the minute we do, we're not doing sola scriptura theology, and essentially we're just like everybody else. So as a policy, I never consult Ellen White on anything. And if I'm influenced by her thinking and anything, then I do my best to get rid of that because I want to work entirely with the scripture. Okay, so there might be other objections out there. And again, the point of this video is if anybody has such objections, I'm curious to hear what they are. I've probably heard many more than these, but these are the ones that I could recall when I put this video together. And none of the other ones I've come across were much better than these. Okay, so why do I think this is a plausible idea? It's very simple. It's not a major revelation here. Essentially, the Bible has different kinds of prophecies, and there's prophecies about many different things. The second coming of Christ is itself a prophecy. Jesus said, "Hey, I'm coming back." The Bible talks about the end of the world. All these things have been in Scripture, have been mentioned, and the prophecies in the Bible are of two types. Some are conditional and some are not. So some prophecies are influenced by different factors that revolve around people. So, whether the Ninevites repent or not, that affects the result of the prophecy. Whether Israel is faithful or not, that depends when they're going to enter the promised land, earlier or later. Um, Different types of prophecies are, some of the prophecies in the Bible are affected by what people do, and other prophecies don't seem to be affected by anything. So, for example, the prophecy of Christ coming, first coming, Daniel has this, in Daniel 9, we have the prophecy of the 70 weeks and all this stuff. I don't think there's anything anybody could have done to change that. And if there was, God would not have predicted a specific date. But essentially, God made a sovereign decision at a certain date for Jesus to come and to be born into this world, and that's the way it was. And there's other prophecies that are essentially that way. Like God just decides ahead of time, these things are going to happen. These empires are going to come and then they're going to leave or be conquered and so on. And things happen that way, and there's not much anybody can do to change it. So the question is, which kind of prophecy is the second coming? And the answer is that we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. So I think naturally we would think the second coming should be one of those unconditional prophecies, like probably like say we lived in the time of the pioneers, in the mid 1800s, and we try to decide is the second coming a conditional prophecy or an unconditional prophecy. We would probably go with unconditional because it seems like the second coming might be one of those things that God has determined. But as time progresses, and a lot of time has passed since the time of the pioneers, it's starting to actually make more sense that the second coming might be one of the conditional prophecies, not in the sense that it's never going to happen if we don't fulfill certain conditions, but in the sense that it could delay his coming if we don't fulfill some certain conditions. Okay, so why would we say that? Well, one of the ways I think of it is from the perspective of the effects of somebody constantly raising hope in something, and then that hope doesn't materialize, and then they raise your hope again and it doesn't materialize, and so on. So for example, like, let's say you're expecting a friend to come visit you, and he says, "Hey, I'll be there next week." And then the next week comes, and you're all excited, and then he says, "Hey, sorry, something came up, and I'm not coming anymore." And he says, but don't worry, I'll come next month. And then the next one comes, it's like, no, something came up and I don't come anymore. At some point, if somebody keeps playing that game with you, you kind of give up and you stop waiting for them, or you stop caring, because this sort of constant up and down in expectation has sort of a kind of like a psychological impact, to where it's just too much emotional investment to keep hoping on something that just seems to, where you seem to keep being let down. And it's kind of like that with the second coming, because Jesus tells the apostles, "Hey, I'm going away, and I'll come again, come back and receive it to myself." So people wait and wait a few centuries, 1, 2, 3 centuries, and then they start changing their theology, and they basically say, like, "Look, maybe we misunderstood. Maybe God is timeless, so He doesn't have the same sense of time like we do, or maybe like what God meant is that." His coming is reflected through the church. So the Roman Empire became Christian, and now the Christianity is spreading everywhere. So maybe that's what was represented through Jesus saying he's coming back. So it was more like a symbolic promise or whatever. So people have found different ways to live with the idea of this delay. And then we get to the 1800s, and first, William Miller says, "Oh, I worked out the prophecies. The prophecies predicted this delay. It had a specific amount of time. Now the time period is over. We've had the 1,260 years of papal supremacy. We have another prophecy that takes us a few more years to 1844, and then it's time. It's time for Jesus to come. So people get excited, they get ready, and he doesn't come. And then our pioneers say, "Oh, we misunderstood something. It wasn't that he was coming; it was that he was starting the investigative judgment." So now everybody says, okay, so this is it. So he's doing this final judgment and he's about to come. And we have a whole generation of this first generation of the pioneers believing that it's a matter of years, 5, 10, 20 years until the judgment is complete and Jesus is about to come. So they're going everywhere and saying, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. Essentially telling people, like, look, we're actually in that final stretch. It's time for him to come. And then another 150 years pass. So at some point, this constant letdown has a negative impact on people. And I don't think the kind of God we serve, would do that kind of thing unless there was a need to do it because there was something getting in the way. So essentially, I don't think God is the one to blame for time stretching like this, or else either our whole idea was wrong. So again, that's a possibility. Maybe we're wrong about the whole thing in 1844, or he would have not started the. If he really needed time to go on this long, then he would have started the judgment a little bit later, because again, the whole idea that the judgment needs to take that many years, I don't think that's a good reason for it either. So anyway, so what I'm saying is that this constant hope and let down, hope and let down, hope and let down, so to speak, this roller coaster ride is not healthy, and the loving God we serve would not do that to us. So I think it makes sense. Maybe 100 years ago, it made more sense to say the second coming is probably one of the unconditional prophecies. But after all this time has passed, it makes more sense to assume that it's probably a conditional prophecy and something happened that has forced a delay. So again, the way I'm presenting this concept or this construct of the delay is that it's the kind of thing that it's there isn't a way to demonstrate biblically that it happened, but it's the kind of thing that becomes more and more plausible the more time passes, at least from where I stand now. um, uh, in my conversations with people that are supportive of Adventist theology, they don't seem to have a problem with the delay for some reason. And I'm talking about the people that reject the idea of the delay. They don't seem to have a problem with the fact that so much time has passed since 1844. And I think it's because they're not really thinking through the implications of our sanctuary theology. Because outside critics do have a problem with it. So I've talked to a lot of people, both Adventists and non-Adventists, who say, hey, there's a lot of things we disagree with Adventist theology, but even if you guys were correct, Jesus would have come a while back. The fact that Jesus hasn't come yet proves that you're not correct in your 1844 theology. So the implications of 1844 and the implications of the sanctuary are understood better sometimes by our critics than by many of our own people, because the way they see it, uh, if our theology was correct, Jesus would have come back by now. And the fact that he didn't proves that he wasn't. And I would say, yeah, that's the correct implication. And I think the best explanation we can give to that, because I do think we have solid reasons for holding on to our theology. And the best explanation we could give is that there has been a delay. All right. So this idea of a delay tends to make sense, uh, make better sense of some of the problems in Adventist theology as well. So these are just some simple reasons why I think um, the concept of the delay is a valid concept, and I think we need to seriously consider it as a church. Okay, so now let's address some of the issues that last generation theology people might have, and look at this from their perspective and why I think that doesn't work, and then uh, look at it again from what I would say is a valid perspective. Now, um, the way last generation theology people look at the great controversy is that they see the controversy revolving around the question of whether the law of God can be kept. So they're saying, okay, the debate is, can God's law be kept? And because that's the debate, there needs to be a demonstration that it could be kept. So there's something that we have to do before Christ can come. And that's the source of the delay. We haven't demonstrated to the universe that we can keep God's law flawlessly, and because of that, God is forced to keep delaying. But in their mind, the controversy revolves around this issue of, is the law of God the kind of thing that can be kept? Okay. Now, when we move away from LGT, the central issue in the great controversy is not whether the law of God can be kept, but whether it should be kept. Okay. In other words, is the law of God the kind of thing that when somebody was able to see all the ramifications of living life according to this law or contrary to this law, would they, looking at the whole thing and understanding all these elements of the ramifications of keeping God's law, would they be wanting, is the law the kind of thing somebody would want to keep, or is it the kind of thing they would not want to keep? Think of it like this. Like, for example, say you have a child and you tell them, hey, you need to brush your teeth, you need to brush your teeth. And they don't want to do it and they complain, but you keep telling them, you should brush your teeth before you go to bed or whatever. Well, when that child grows up and is mature enough to evaluate the situation for themselves, would they say, hey, that rule that their parents made them follow, was it a legitimate rule? Was it a rule that was worth following? Or were their parents being um, overly demanding or unreasonable in forcing them to brush their teeth every night? And I would say the great controversy is based on whether or not the laws of God are the kinds of laws that we would want to keep if we fully understood their ramifications, or we wouldn't. And one of the reasons why there is this great controversy, why we are here in this world, is because God has allowed the consequences of sin to be demonstrated. So the delay under the LGT paradigm is based on something that we have to do to prove a point. The delay under the non-LGT paradigm is sin. Sin is given an opportunity to reveal what it really is. So basically, Adam and Eve sinned, and God said, okay, we're going to give them time, and we're going to see the domino effect, so to speak, of what it is like to live contrary to my laws. And we've had thousands of years now where time unfolds, and the whole universe has a chance to observe what happens when created beings don't live according to God's law. So several thousand years passed, and then Jesus came, and Jesus revealed to humanity the love of the Father, and basically he revealed it to the whole universe. God was willing to give his life for us. Satan revealed his true colors by being willing to put to death his own creator. Um, and the one other thing that still needs time to unfold is the character of sin. And the universe has had several thousand years before the cross to see the results of sin. But now another new question that came on the sin is, um, what happens now that humanity has a chance to know about the gospel and to know about the love of God? So the apostles go out and preach, and some people accept it, some people reject it. But one of the things that happens over time is that the church ends up figuring out that they could use the gospel to manipulate and control the masses. And the gospel, which is, a great display of God's love for us, and should teach us that we should care for other people as well, ended up being converted into something that can be used to enslave humanity. And for several hundred years, or even 1,000 years, it was used in that way. So the gospel was misapplied. It was used as a tool of manipulation. Um, okay, so then that kind of explains why there has been a delay for this thousands of years, because those are not the kinds of things you could see immediately. So like you could say, hey, Jesus came and died, he paid the penalty for sin, now he's able to save humanity. Why didn't he come back immediately, maybe in another 10, 20 years? Well, we needed time to see the effects of the gospel and to see how humanity, sinful humanity, would deal with it. And that time was a long time. It was over 1,000 years, maybe 1,500 years till the Reformation, and then sometime after that. So, so now another step that happened is, since the time of 1844, I think one of the elements we've had is a better and better understanding of the economy of God. So we understood the great controversy, we understood the sanctuary, we understood all these pieces that have given us a much better picture. So not only do we understand God's love through the gospel, but we understand the whole picture of everything that has happened. So now there's a little bit of time left, giving us a chance to see the effects of this. And if we take advantage of the knowledge we have and everything that God has revealed to us to become better, to do the work that He has given us, then we could probably hasten Christ's coming, or we could probably delay by not living up to the life we have in that sense. Okay, so what are some of the looking at things from a negative perspective, in the sense that, like, what what mistakes has the church done over the past century or so that could have delayed Christ's coming, and then we'll look at it from some of the things that we should have done or we should be doing. Okay, so from the 1850s on, from the time we've kind of formed as a denomination, um, there's been quite a bit of history, but the first several decades were a time when we just needed to figure out what we believe. So um, it's understandable that there was a delay. In other words, that Jesus didn't come immediately after 1844 or immediately after 1850, because we needed time to figure out a lot of stuff. And over the next 30 years or so, there's been a lot of additions to our theology as people were studying, as different things took place, and we started slowly building up a coherent theological system. So essentially, if those things were important, we needed that time, and we can't expect for Christ coming to have been earlier than the first few decades after the church first formed. And then we get to like the 1880s or so, and then we know from, because that was kind of a significant time in Adventist history, we know that the church kind of fell into a legalistic type of a um, state, after several decades of focusing so much on the law and on the Sabbath and on all these elements that's divided us or separated us from other Christians, to the point where we kind of lost track of the cross, that side of the cross. So we have 1888 in an attempt to remedy that. And when that happened, Jones and Wagner, Ellen White, a lot of the leaders opposed it. So that kind of created a division in the church. So that's legalism before 1888, the whole events around 1888, the aftermath of 1888 with a lot of the controversy that followed. And if people are not familiar with this history, I invite you to pick up an Adventist history book, because it's too much for me to go over in a video like this. Soon after that, we have the death of Ellen White in the early 1900s. And then we have a sort of fundamentalist turn in our denomination, because people started wrestling with the idea of Ellen White's writings, because she had passed away and she couldn't oversee the process of what to do with her writings after that. So people had to start looking into that question, and they were having a hard time figuring out how to think about her because she would write something and then she would include elements in a writing at a certain time, and then some decades later she would revise that writing and change certain things, like for example historical data, historical information, and she'll have editors come in and fix things up, and then people couldn't figure out how that works with the idea of inspiration, because if you're inspired, then why isn't everything exactly the way it's supposed to be, and all this stuff. So essentially pretty much the same questions that a lot of other Christians were dealing with when it comes to scripture, because we have the whole debate about the inerrancy of scripture. Is the Bible perfect the way it's written? Does it have errors and things like that? And a lot of our leaders at this moment in time in the early 1900s, they understood the process by which Ellen White put her writings together, and they were trying to get the denomination to acknowledge the fact that her writings were not inerrant, and to have a good sense of how to work with them. But a decision was made at the time not to involve the church in these questions and to sort of sweep it under the rug. And this began a trend in our church where people put Ellen White on a pedestal, and um, they've accepted some of the other elements of fundamentalism where you're just sort of stuck in you have certain parameters, and your whole thought process functions within these parameters, and you don't break out of it, and has set our church in a pathway that has caused problems ever since. So that's something that and if anybody is interested in this section, there's a lot of stuff that has been written on the question of the early 1900s and fundamentalism in Adventism. I don't have the time to go into it now, but this is a mistake that the church made, or a pathway that it took that affected our ability to do our work. It affected our capacity to do what we were called to do as a church. So if in fact a delay could have happened, these could be very good reasons why it might have happened. So whether things happened in 1888, whether in the early 1900s. After this, because of the fundamentalist mentality, we started putting more emphasis on evangelism than on theology. And because of that, our theology was not fully developed enough to make sense with the rest of the world. So we kind of took a conspiratorial approach to things, just focusing on telling people all this prophetic stuff that is supposed to happen, kind of scaring people into the church. And not everybody has done this, but this has been kind of a trend in some of our people in the way they do evangelism. And this is not saying anything against our approach to prophecy. I think our approach to prophecy is valid, but the way we have used it in the past hasn't been good. Now, when it comes to other people, other Christians, a lot of them have classified us as a cult. And again, we could say, hey, who cares what they think? But the problem is, if we're called to take the gospel to the world, and all the other Christians around us see us as a cult, it limits our ability to do our work. And if we had done the theological work, done the work necessary to fully develop our theology properly, and if we had understood how to communicate this theology to the outside world in a way that made sense to them, things would have been different. And I'm not saying everybody would just embrace us with open arms, because in a sense, we're always in competition. I mean, if the members from their churches come to our churches, they're losing money, they're losing influence, and so on. But still, that doesn't mean it's an excuse for us to do a bad job at communicating our position to the outside world. So these are some of the elements that I think have affected our trajectory as a church. In the 1930s or so, we have Andreasen, who came up with last generation theology. And I think this is probably one of the biggest, one of the most damaging elements in the history of Adventism, because it introduced this approach to Adventist theology that set us in a very problematic direction. And I've talked a lot about that stuff in previous videos on this channel, so feel free to go back and listen to that if you have questions on this. But once last generation theology started spreading through the church, a few decades later, we have the questions on doctrines, controversy, Andreasen introducing this conspiracy about how the denominational leaders, excuse me, denominational leaders are moving away from the Adventist positions. Um, we have the rise of the supporting ministries in the church kind of splitting away. And I've talked about this in a previous video, how essentially what happened in the Adventist church is the same thing that happened in other churches, but in other churches, the church would have split in different groups, right? So other denominations like us, when they went through similar crises as the ones we went to in the 1960s surrounding questions on doctrine and that controversy, other denominations would have split. But our denomination didn't split because Ellen White has said that there's not going to be any other church. So essentially, the people that wanted to split because they felt that the leadership had gone off on a tangent and had apostatized, they couldn't leave because Ellen White said, no, there's no coming out. There's not going to be any other coming out of the Adventist church. So what they did instead is they created a movement within a movement. So it's this notion that, they're the only faithful in Adventism, and they're not gonna leave, but they cannot do anything about the leadership because leadership is apostate. So they're gonna be faithful when nobody else is. So that's where we have all this independent ministries, supporting ministries, all these different groups starting their own kind of program, essentially like kind of doing their own thing, but kind of trying to stay as just close enough to the church where they're not kicked out, but no closer, so to speak. And essentially all this stuff that has happened has proven to be a failure because it's been 60 years since it all happened, right? So if there was any value, any sense to what all these people were doing back then, it would have had some kind of impact right now. In other words, if it's the left side of the church back then, so if it was people like Froome and the GC and everybody else that were wrong, and Andresen and his followers were right, and if the idea of a movement within a movement was the right thing to do, then Jesus would have come by now because they were doing the right thing. Evidently, he hasn't, so that didn't work. And not just this, but if you look at what was accomplished through 60 years of history, essentially they've changed their positions on a lot of stuff. Their ministries are failing financially. They're failing in many other respects. And I've talked about, I and others have talked about this in the past, and there's going to be other things we're going to bring up probably in future episodes as well. But I think it's safe to say, looking back at 60 years of history, that this whole idea of a movement within a movement was wrong, and it has failed. But a lot of people are stuck in it, like I mentioned in previous videos, where they can't really get out because of all the political elements and everything else. But as far as our church, if anything has destroyed our ability to do our work, it's this, because it's essentially split the church in half, and we're kind of fighting against each other, not really getting anywhere. So this is, if we're looking for reasons for it, this is a very clear reason why we're still here, as opposed to having finished the work that we're called to do. Of course, after Andresen, 20 years later, so after the QOD stuff, Ford comes on the scene, and it's only natural that somebody like Ford will show up, because by this time the church is so steep in LGT, everybody's like worrying about their own salvation, worrying about their own perfection. I can't give up cheese, I can give up chocolate. There's all these elements that our people are struggling with. So of course, somebody like Ford comes on the scene and says, hey, this whole stuff is nonsense. It doesn't work. And then he goes off and says, the reason for it is the whole Adventist sanctuary doctrine, when in fact the reason for it was LGT. And so Ford comes on and he throws out his stuff against the sanctuary, against the prophetic interpretations of Daniel and the book of Hebrews, our interpretations of Hebrews. He gives us all his arguments, and the whole glacier view stuff happens. For those that don't know history, I invite you to look that up. But interestingly enough, Ford is actually coming from what today would be considered a conservative evangelical, probably even fundamentalist perspective. But the effects of what he did were not so much an evangelical turn in the church, but more of a turn towards progressive, the progressive side of things, which is the equivalent of kind of the more liberal side of the outside Christian world. So if you go and look around at other Christians, you have sort of the more conservative Christians out there, and you have the more liberal Protestants. And even though Ford was pushing a conservative version of Protestantism, his stuff, what ended up happening is that his theology weakened the elements in Adventist theology that were protecting us from some of the more progressive aspects of Christian theology. So now we have, over the next 40 years now, we've had um, a lot of the more progressive elements of Christianity coming to our church. This created a state of pluralism and eventually relativism, to where people say, "Hey, what you believe is good, and this is my version of Adventism, and your stuff." And we have this denomination now that is essentially composed of numerous other denominations, theologically speaking. And the results of this is that we have a kind of an administratorial gridlock, because the way our church is structured, we have the members and what the members believe and where they're at theologically and spiritually. And then from the membership, we have people that go into the ministry, and people in the ministry go into administration, or they go into theology. And the theology affects everything that, because the theologians train our pastors, and then the pastors go to the churches, and the administrators make the decisions about hiring. So essentially, it's like this mechanism that all the parts affect all the other parts. And because we have pluralism at the highest level, in terms of pluralism in our among our theology schools, where the pastors go to get trained. So the pastors have pluralistic theologies. The administrators do, and because of this, it's very hard for the church to really move and do anything and make decisions, make corrections, because there's so many points of view and so many perspectives. So we're in this situation, and if we were going to step back and say, what reason could there be for a delay? Hey, this is it. There's a lot of good reasons for a delay right here. I mean, if we treated our denomination the way we would look at a business, if somebody was a consultant, right? And they were hired by a company to go evaluate their company. So let's say we have this global business like Apple or Google or something, and somebody went there and looked at all the elements in this business, and they stepped back and kind of got a feel of the big picture. They could say, wow, here's all the reasons why our company isn't doing very well. Well, hey, these are a lot of the big reasons why our church isn't really doing what it could be doing. So if there is such a thing as a delay, these are probably the reasons why it's happening. So now let's look at it from a positive perspective as to what could have been done differently, or what could we do differently. Well, I would say we need much better theological development. And in my other channel, the Sola Scriptura channel, I've tried to explain things kind of like this. Again, if we step back and we look at the whole Christian world, we can put everybody into different categories based on the logic of their theology and belief system. And the question is, where do Adventists fit within these different groups of people? So you have this particular theological perspective here that maybe it's Catholic and Orthodox and other denominations fall into. And then you have maybe conservative Protestants here, and fundamentalists, and then you have the liberal Protestants, and so on. Where do Adventists fit here? Or are we part of one of these groups, or do we have something of our own to contribute? And what I've argued is that as Adventists, we're actually a whole different approach to things. So if we could put everybody into different groups, we're not a different version of one of the other groups. We actually are introducing our own stuff. And our own stuff, again, is how to do theology with the Bible alone. And because we have our unique perspective, our unique approach to theology, we need to take serious time to develop it and to think through the whole thing from beginning to end. All the other groups have had hundreds of years sometimes, and they've had thousands of people, millions of people even, to really reason to their whole theology and to put it together so it makes sense. We, on the other hand, we've had a limited amount of time, and we've actually spent that time. I've had very few people that have really tried to make sense of our theology and to put it together properly. So we have a lot of work to do there, and to understand exactly where we're coming from and what we're trying to say, and how we're reasoning to our entire perspective of what reality is all about. But once we do this, we still have a lot of work, because then we have to explain how our view of theology applies to all the other elements in our life, in our existence. So, for example, how does Adventist theology relate to science? Well, we don't have hardly anything useful to say on that topic, because we've been spending time up to now pretty much copying other Christian groups. So, we've been copying the fundamentalists and using their strategies, and copying the other Protestants, and then people that have kind of moved away from Adventist theology have started to copy some of the more liberal Protestants in relation to science. But we have our own perspective on things, and this has ramifications for how we view science, and we need to clarify that and make it in such a way so that it makes sense to the rest of the world. And the same thing for philosophy, for law, politics, medicine. So we still have quite a bit of work to do to make sense of our own approach to things, and then to apply that to all these other fields, and explain to people how we think about stuff. Now, these things are not just, so in other words, what we're trying to do is not to convince everybody that they're wrong and we're right, because there's actually a lot of perspectives out there. There's people coming from different perspectives, and it's not just Christians. There's atheists. There's a lot of other religions. Some of them believe in a God. Some of them believe in other supernatural type stuff. There's many varieties of Christians. And each one of these groups has a certain theological outlook that has practical ramifications on all these elements. And they have their philosophers and their thought leaders that have found ways to make sense of how these things apply, how their theological outlook applies to the world, to our practical existence, and these have implications for society. And we need to work through all this stuff for ourselves, given that we have a unique view on things. If we were just one aspect of some other perspective, so like let's say we're pretty much in the same boat with all the other Protestants, and we just had our own slight differences, then we wouldn't have to do all this work. And a lot of the stuff Adventists have done has almost been done from that perspective. Like, hey, we're just slightly different than some of these other people, so we don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel. But unfortunately, that's not really who we are. We have our own view on things, and we need to think through all these elements ourselves. And that's a lot of work. And if we had spent the past 100 years focusing on this instead of doing all the other stuff we've been doing, like trying to go into the mountains and reach perfection of character or whatever, through LGT, or a lot of the other stuff that I've listed on the previous page, we might have been a lot further along, and we might have been closer to finishing our work. Because as we do these things, we can actually communicate our perspective to the rest of the world, and we could say, look, here's this perspective, here's that perspective, and here's our perspective as an alternative possibility. But not just this, each one of these perspectives makes certain predictions. So people coming from, let's just use an example of the dispensationalist, right? The dispensationalist perspective makes predictions. If all of a sudden half the world disappears, like people just kind of disappear out of nowhere, your father's gone, your mother's gone, your neighbor's gone all of a sudden, hey, the rapture happened. That means there's 7 years of tribulation. So their theology has certain predictions. We may disagree with the theology, but if those things happen, then we know they're right. Okay? So in the same way, our view of things has certain predictions about things that are things that are going to take place, about the way things are supposed to work. And as we work through our stuff and make sense of all the predictive elements in our way of thinking, we can present that to the rest of the world so that people have a chance to say, hey, these guys have a certain rationale. Their rationale led them to certain conclusions. And hey, those conclusions actually came true. So maybe they're onto something. And then they could take us seriously when it's time for them to need to take us seriously. So for example, in the final events of history. So all this stuff has to be done if we're really going to take the gospel to the whole world. We weren't called to take the gospel only to like the simplest members of society who are going to believe everything we're saying just because they're superstitious or because they could be easily influenced. Because if that's the case, the next person that comes along is going to influence them in another direction. We're called to take the gospel to everybody, even the thought leaders of society. And to be able to do that, we have to do all this work that hasn't been done yet. Okay, so now as we do this work, we need to rethink about the way we do church in general, because um, we're one small group that has to compete with much larger denominations and that has a whole world to reach, because we're the only ones really pushing this approach. We're the only ones taking this approach to theology. And we're never going to be able to do it at the pace we're doing it with, a few evangelists, a few pastors, a few theologians and so on. No, the only way we're going to be able to really take our ideas out there is if all our members participate, if everyone is involved. So what that means, we need to change our model from having this pastor shepherd type of system that everybody else uses, keeping in mind that everybody else has so many more people than we do, and switch to a trainer model where pastors go in and they train our members to actually do the work that we're trying to do. So we need to start building churches that actually make sense, churches that are viable. Because to be honest, right now, and I've traveled all over the United States. I haven't been, I've been a few places in the world, but at least in the United States, I've been through hundreds of churches all over the place, and meetings and camp meetings and all kinds of gatherings. And our churches are not in any condition to really be uh, reaching anybody with our message. So we have a lot of work to do. We need people that are trainers that go out and train our members to do what the pastors are doing now. They need to be educated, theologically educated. They need to be discipled so that they have their own experience with God and they're stable and they're mature in their experience so they could actually go out and do the work. And they need ministry opportunities, and they need to be taught how to do this work. So there's a ton of stuff we have to do, from the theoretical level all the way down to the practical level, that we haven't done. And we can't even do at this point because there's so much conflict of vision in the church. Everybody's looking at things from a different perspective, and it's next to impossible to get anything done at this moment in time. And once we figure this out here, we need to export it to the rest of the world, because we have a global message, and we need to go into every region and adapt our process to that region. So as we work through, for example, our philosophy, well, our philosophy makes sense maybe here because of the way people think here, but what if we went to India, or what if we went to China, where people are coming from a very different philosophical perspective? We have to go there and figure out how they think and figure out how to communicate our way of thinking to them so that it makes sense to them. So all this stuff still needs to be done. And if there's any reasons why we're still here today, it's because it hasn't been done yet. And it didn't need to take this long. I mean, we could have been working at this for a century now, but instead we've been doing a lot of other stuff. Right? So my conclusion is this. I think as a church, we need to reconsider the concept of the delay as a construct, as a possibility. And either we take it seriously or we come up with better arguments against it. In other words, I would like to hear somebody put together a very well thought out counter to this concept, if in fact it isn't correct. If people are convinced that this idea isn't correct, then come up with a well put together presentation against it that is well thought out, that has real sound arguments, so that we can take it seriously. And if we can't, and if in fact the possibility exists that we're here longer than we should have been, then we need to start taking seriously why it is that we're still here, because otherwise we're just going to keep delaying things for no reason and end up pushing things back even further. I just can't imagine, like, for example, if I was waiting for somebody I cared about, like say my child, to come home after they had been away on some trip, and I found out that there was something I was doing wrong that was preventing them from coming home, I can't imagine just sitting there carelessly and saying, well, whatever, whenever they figure it out, they figure it out. No, I would try to do everything I can to remedy the situation so that they're not delayed any longer. So essentially, I just can't imagine people being in limbo on this topic. Either they agree with it or they disagree with it. If they disagree with it, come up with real arguments. I mean, don't come at us with arguments that are not even Adventist. Okay, find some way to convince us that there's something wrong with the delay concept from within the Adventist theological framework, or then we need to have another debate about that. But that's a whole separate thing. But come up with good arguments against it, or if not, let's take it seriously because it's a serious idea. If it's true, it has serious ramifications. So anyway, that's my thoughts on this issue. There's a lot more that could have been said, but in terms of like addressing more counter arguments and dealing with more aspects of the issue, but this is just, I think, kind of a good summary of it. Enough for people to have something to debate with or argue with or discuss or think about. So I hope to hear back from some people on this, and if not, I thank you for sitting down through an hour and a half or whatever it's been of me babbling here. Well, anyway, thanks and God bless.